The glass walls of the conference room reflected back my face as if they wanted to remind me where I stood. Every time I saw my own outline against that surface, I felt the same mixture of anticipation and dread. I walked in carrying my laptop pressed close to my ribs, like armor against a battlefield of polished shoes, designer watches, and loud voices. The air inside was already heavy with chatter. A few colleagues were huddled around Carter, our newly appointed product lead, who loved to talk with his hands and louder still with his laugh. They did not notice me at first. Or maybe they did and decided not to acknowledge me. It was hard to tell, and honestly, I had stopped trying to figure it out months ago. I placed my laptop at the far end of the table and let my fingers linger on the smooth silver cover. The room smelled faintly of burnt coffee and air conditioning, a mixture that always reminded me of ambition stretched too thin. I told myself one more time that this was just another meeting, just another chance to show the numbers. Numbers never lied. People did, but not data. When Carter finally spotted me, he smirked the way one does when a child insists on showing a drawing at the dinner table. "Ah, Fleming," he said with that easy voice that filled the room, "ready to enlighten us with your charts." I forced my smile. My slides were more than charts. They were the culmination of 3 weeks of late nights, parsing thousands of user actions, building models, testing patterns, discarding the noise until only clarity remained. The proposal was simple. $2,000. That was all I needed for a pilot. $2,000 in a company where the coffee budget for a single month exceeded 3 times that amount. I connected the laptop to the projector. The screen lit up with the first slide. Clean white, blue lines, neat fonts. The kind of presentation executives could skim without complaint. My voice came steady, even though my stomach twisted. I explained the principle. Every click, every pause, every hover over a button was a message. If we listened closely, we could predict what the user would do before they did it. For 10 minutes, I spoke without interruption. I walked them through timelines, return on investment, projected retention lifts, risk mitigation. I could see Sarah from marketing nodding slowly, her eyes narrowing in concentration, as if she understood the potential. For a moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, the tide was shifting. Then Carter leaned back in his chair. His sneakers squeaked against the polished floor. He raised his eyebrows like he had just solved a riddle. "So, let me get this straight," he said. "You want us to give you $2,000 so you can play with artificial intelligence because you think you found some magic formula in how people click buttons?" A ripple of laughter spread through his small circle of supporters. One of them whispered into his hand, and the sound of muffled chuckling filled the room. My fingers tightened on the remote. "It is more than that," I said. "The analysis shows intent patterns. It means we can predict churn before." He cut me off with a lazy wave of his hand. "The analysis shows you have been living in Excel too long. This is not a grad school project, Ren. This is a technology company. We need big moves, not science fair projects." His words landed like blows, not because of what he said, but because of how everyone reacted. A few shifted uncomfortably, but no one defended me. Sarah looked down at her notepad. Another colleague tapped nervously at his phone. I pushed on, showing the next slide. "The small trial we can," Carter leaned forward now, adopting a tone of mock sympathy. "We appreciate the effort, really. All these slides, all this work, very academic, but not relevant. You should focus on what you do best. Documentation, process flows. Leave innovation to those who understand the market." That word, documentation, hit like a verdict. I closed my laptop with a soft click. I had no intention of begging. "Thank you for your time," I said. My voice did not tremble. I gathered my things slowly, carefully, refusing to rush. As I walked toward the door, Carter called after me, his voice just loud enough for everyone to hear. "Next time, maybe run it by someone before wasting the room's time." The door opened beneath my hand, and I stepped out. The hallway stretched long and sterile, lined with posters about innovation and bold ideas, slogans printed in glossy ink. I almost laughed at the irony. My desk sat waiting in the open office floor, rows of identical chairs and screens, each humming with the same corporate indifference. I sat down and opened the laptop again. The slides were still there, untouched by Carter's sarcasm. The projections still held. The numbers still spoke the truth, yet the humiliation clung to me like static. I could still hear the laughter echoing. I replayed every word he said, every smirk, every dismissive glance. It was not the rejection that stung, but the arrogance, the way he turned evidence into entertainment. That night I stayed late. The office emptied, chairs pushed in neatly, screens dark. Only the hum of servers kept me company. My proposal lay open on the screen again. I scrolled through the slides, fingers tracing numbers I knew were right. They had not argued with the data. They had not disproved the logic. They had simply dismissed me, and then I remembered it. The line whispered by one of Carter's juniors. He had said it as a joke, maybe even to make Carter laugh harder. Anyway, the company rule says if it is rejected, it doesn't exist. Rejected, doesn't exist. At the time, I let it slip past me. Now, hours later, it circled in my mind like a code waiting to be solved. The office after 9 felt like a different city. Elevators sighed without witnesses. The copy machine blinked an unhurried green. Far away, someone from cleaning pushed a cart that chimed gently whenever it hit a seam in the tile. I stayed because going home would mean sitting with silence, and the silence would replay the meeting in perfect detail. Here, at least, I could pretend that work was still listening. I reopened the deck and watched the first slide bloom on the screen. The white space was clean and orderly, the graphs calm as a lake. There was relief in the neatness. Numbers never raised their voices. They did not laugh. They stayed exactly where you put them until you asked again. I printed a copy of the document, not because I needed paper, but because the sound of the printer made the room feel less empty. As the pages slid out, I remembered the throwaway line from the junior during the meeting. If it is rejected, it does not exist. He had said it as a joke, a nudge to earn another smile from Carter. The kind of line that floats by like lint, yet now it anchored itself inside me. I opened the shared policy repository. Years of handbooks, handoffs, compliance reminders. Buried among them was an internal memo about intellectual property acknowledgments. I skimmed with the tired speed of a person who has read too many documents to count. The memo referenced the Master Employment Agreement and a companion schedule that covered proposal submission and review. There were cross-references to an older revision, which made me think of a family tree of forms, each one inheriting features from the last. I searched for the phrase rejection. There it was, in a section about project approvals and budgeted initiatives, the line that noted the status of proposals that did not proceed. It was not definitive. It was not even bolded. But the wording suggested a door cracked open. I made a note to read the full agreement at home, where no one would stare over my shoulder. At 10:30, I finally packed my bag. The corridor lights were set to evening dim, and the office felt like a museum of objects that remembered people fondly. My badge clicked me through the turnstile. Outside, the street smelled like rain that had not yet fallen. I stood under the flank of the building and let the night settle around me. Across the boulevard, a ramen shop glowed warm and yellow. Inside, people laughed like the day had worked out fine. I walked instead. My apartment was 15 minutes away if I did not wait for lights. On the way, I passed the corner where a flower stall closes at 7. There were 2 buckets left out, brimming with stems no one bought. The petals turned their backs to the street as if they had decided the world had admired them enough. I thought of the slide where the retention curve bends upward and holds. It is a beautiful shape. It says that faith in the right place will be rewarded. Home was a narrow rectangle of light on the 17th floor. I set the laptop on the table and made tea I would forget to drink. I pulled the file box from the side closet, the one where I kept past agreements, tax forms, and warranty cards for appliances that never broke. There it was, the employment packet, a neat stack clipped with a black binder. I took a breath, then began. The preface was familiar language about confidentiality and non-disclosure, about respect for trade secrets, and the usual list of prohibited acts. I read every paragraph, not skimming, not trusting memory. My eyes slowed when I reached the schedule that governed proposals from employees. The heading used formal words, but the sentences were plain. Ideas, concepts, or proposals submitted for review and not approved by the company, and for which the company has made no material financial investment, shall not be considered company property, provided the employee can demonstrate independent creation and authorship. I read it again, and then a third time, tracing the edges with my fingertip as if the ink might smudge. Not considered company property. Independent creation and authorship. No material financial investment. The language did not sing, it simply existed. A cool stone on a hot day. I set the page beside the laptop and opened my folder of drafts. Timestamps shone back at me, neat numbers that marked nights and weekends and mornings before sunrise. Models built in a personal repository. Notes scribbled into a personal doc. A small pilot outline saved in my personal drive with a file history that went back weeks before the meeting. I stared at the combination of paper and screen until the two became part of the same picture. They had laughed at me for asking for $2,000. Their laughter had a cost. Because they never gave a budget, because they never engaged resources, because the meeting ended with a dismissal instead of a work ticket, the company never owned what I had made. It remained mine. It had always been mine. Something loosened in my chest. I did not smile. I did not cheer. I simply recognized a line that had moved in my favor. I photographed the relevant pages of the agreement and saved them to my personal archive. I exported the version history of my drafts into a single document, a tidy chronology that showed where the work began and how it grew. I wrote a short note to myself about the meeting, dated and time-stamped, with the attendees listed, and the words Carter used to end the session. It felt clinical, like labeling a sample in a lab. It felt right. I finally brewed fresh tea and actually drank it. The window framed a city that had decided to be quiet. I imagined the algorithm as a pulse moving through that darkness, noticing when someone paused over a button, when someone scrolled back to reread a detail, when someone walked away. People call it prediction, and sometimes that word scares them. But it is simply listening more closely than we are used to. I felt protective of it. I felt protective of the younger version of myself who had first seen those patterns and believed they meant something. A message came from Sarah. It was short. "I am sorry. I tried to get a word in. You did not deserve that." I typed back, "Thank you." Then I deleted it and typed again. I told her not to worry and that I appreciated the attempt. I did not mention the agreement. I did not mention the line that glowed in my mind like a runway light. Not yet. Sleep found me in fragments. When I dreamed, I was walking through a hallway that stretched on without corners. Doors lined the walls, each labeled with the name of an idea. The doors looked identical until you got close, until you saw which ones had scratches and which ones were never touched. At the end of the hall was an empty sign. No words, just a rectangle of polished brass. In the dream, I pressed my palm to it and felt a warmth spread up my arm. Morning returned me to the same apartment and the same table. I ate toast without tasting it and read the news without understanding a single headline. When I reached the office, the day had already hardened into routine. Carter glided past my desk with a ceramic cup. "Good morning," he said, and for a second I thought he might apologize. He did not. He asked if I could send over my documentation for the old onboarding flows. He was thinking of handing some of that to the new junior on our team. "A great opportunity for mentorship," he said. The smile he used for the word mentorship belonged in a photograph. "Of course," I said, and it came out almost gentle. He nodded as if the world was as it should be. My access to the analytics sandbox was pending review. The message popped up when I tried to log in. I sent a polite note to support and received an auto reply that someone would assist me by end of week. It was Tuesday. At noon, a calendar invitation landed. Product strategy moved from 10 to 8:30 for the rest of the quarter. No explanation, no apology. I had a standing call with our team in Dublin every Tuesday and Thursday at 8:30. The new time would force me to choose. I accepted the invitation anyway. There was no point arguing with a wall that had decided to be a wall. On the way back from the kitchen with coffee, I passed the glass conference room where new hires watched a video about values. The subtitles declared that ideas are welcomed from everywhere. The soundtrack swelled like a parade. I stood there for a heartbeat too long before I kept walking. That afternoon, Monica from Human Resources emailed to request a quick check-in. Her subject line used friendly words. In the small meeting room, she asked how I was adjusting to the new leadership style. She asked whether I felt aligned with our innovation goals. She said there had been some concerns that I tended to push my own process. I thought about explaining that I only pushed when the numbers were already walking by themselves. I thought about asking whether alignment meant agreement without questions. Instead, I told her that I was fine. The word hung there, thin but sufficient. When I left, I understood something important. They did not want to fix a problem. They wanted the problem to leave. That evening, I wrote down everything that needed to be clean. I would not sabotage. I would not grab at things that were never mine. I would finish the documentation I owed to anyone who would come after me. I would make sure no one could say I left a mess. Then I would walk out carrying only what belonged to me. The agreement was clear, and I would honor the clarity. I started a private checklist. It had simple lines. Export version history. Photograph file properties. Pull email threads that showed the timeline of my thinking before the formal submission. Write a plain statement that certifies independent creation using personal time and personal tools. Send it to myself and to a private counsel, and to a neutral time stamping service. The plan felt calm. It felt like a hand resting lightly on my back that guided me toward a door I had not realized was already open. On Wednesday, Derek from engineering stopped by my desk. He was new enough to still look surprised by everything. He asked if I could help him understand the old churn model we had used before the redesign. He said Carter had put him on predictive work and told him to learn fast. His smile was a little desperate, as if he had been thrown into a pool without a ladder. I showed him the basics. I explained how we built segments and how we defined signals that matter more than noise. I drew tiny diagrams on a sticky note. When he thanked me, the relief in his face made him look younger. I created a small document for him with links to public references that would help him learn. I did not mention the other model, the one that learned to hear intent like a whisper under music. That one was already on a different path. Late that night, the office lights dimmed and the floor settled into its hush again. I opened my personal drive and compiled the narrative of the work. Each artifact had a date and a reason. Each reason had a next step. I did not dramatize. I did not embellish. I let the timeline tell its own story. When I finally shut the laptop, it was close to midnight. I stood in the center of the open floor and looked at the rows of chairs, the tidy cables, the plant that leaned toward the window like it wanted to escape. I thought of all the mornings I had arrived before the sun and all the evenings I had been the last to leave. The room did not care. Rooms never do. But the work cared, in the way that things we make hold a shape of us long after we stop touching them. On the way out, I saw Maria from cleaning near the elevator, pushing her cart with the quiet dignity of someone who knows the names of places no one else notices. She smiled at me like she always did. "Working late again, Miss Wren?" "Last time this week," I said before I knew I would say it. She nodded, eyes kind and sharp at once. "They do not know what they have," she said softly. "People do not always look where the value is." I thanked her and meant it. In the garage, my car waited without judgment. I sat for a moment with the engine off. The elevator lobby hummed behind me. The city threw a thin shine across the windshield. I thought about the word resignation. It shares a root with the word sign. To resign is not only to leave. It is also to inscribe your name at the bottom of a decision. I would sign my name to this. I would step through a door that the small line in the contract had turned into a corridor. Back home, I put the agreement back into the file box and slid it into the closet. Then I took it out again and placed it on the desk. I wanted to see it when I woke. I wanted that sentence to greet me before any other voice could get in. I slept harder than the night before. Morning found me with a steadier pulse. I wore a simple suit that suggested I belonged in any room. The mirror agreed. When I arrived at my desk, a new ticket had been assigned to me for legacy documentation. I opened it and began, moving with a quiet thoroughness that leaves no edges rough. If they wanted this to be the last thing they remembered of my time here, it would be impeccable. At lunch, Sarah slipped into the seat across from me in the cafeteria. She did not do the polite dance. She went straight to the point. "You were right in there," she said. "The numbers were strong. It was politics." I told her I did not need an apology from anyone. She said I deserved better anyway. We ate in silence for a minute, and then she asked what I would do next. I told her I was still deciding. That was true, even though the decision was forming in my chest like a picture coming into focus. I returned to my desk and finished the section I had started. I checked every link. I tested every step. I wrote explanations for the places where the system behaves in ways that are not intuitive, as if I were writing to a future colleague who would arrive nervous on a Tuesday and need a map. When I clicked save, I felt the faint satisfaction of a clean line drawn to its end. Late afternoon brought a calendar update. A leadership showcase was scheduled for next month. Carter would present on innovation pathways. The word innovation sat on the screen and looked at me like a dare. I declined the invitation. The system asked me to provide a reason. I typed conflict and pressed send. At 5:50, I stood and stretched. My eyes were dry. I shut down the company laptop and slid it into the drawer. I took out my personal device and opened a blank document. The title came easily: Certification of Independent Creation. I wrote in the plainest voice I knew. I described the work, the timelines, the tools I used, the absence of company resources, the fact that the proposal had been formally rejected without any investment. I affirmed that the artifacts attached were accurate and complete. I listed the witnesses who had been in the room when Carter ended the meeting. I did not assign blame. I did not mention anyone by opinion. I kept to facts. Facts are patient. Facts do not need to shout. I printed the page and signed my name at the bottom with a pen that writes darker than most. I scanned it and sent it to my private counsel with a short covering note. Then I used a time-stamping service I trust and archived the receipt. When the done notification blinked, I exhaled in a way that felt like a door unlocking. I looked out through the window across the open office. The city was beginning to glitter again. Somewhere out there were people who would understand what this technology could become. Somewhere there were people who would ask the right questions rather than laugh in the right places. I felt the quiet certainty that has always been the truest part of me settle back into my bones. The day had started with a meeting that tried to define me by the limits of someone else's imagination. It ended with a sentence in a contract that gave me back what mattered. In between stood 1,000 small choices to keep my work clean and my exit cleaner. I shut the lights in the small meeting room on my way out. The switch made a soft click. In the darkness that followed, the reflection in the glass looked like a woman who had already stepped beyond this floor. It looked like someone who knew that the first real scene of a story often begins when the door closes behind you. I walked to the elevator and pressed the button. The doors opened with a patient glide. Inside the cab, the panel mirrored my face and the trace of a smile I did not try to hide. The numbers counted down. The ground floor arrived. The evening air met me with the same scent of rain that had not fallen yet. It would soon. I could feel it in the charge that lifts the hair on your arm when the sky is thinking. I crossed to the sidewalk and joined the moving city. The future did not feel far away anymore. It felt near, like a hand at my shoulder, not pushing and not pulling, only reminding me that I was walking in the right direction. The following days blurred together, but the blur was sharp in its own way, the way glass can be blurry yet still cut skin. I went to the office each morning like a person keeping an appointment with inevitability. I greeted people, I opened my laptop, I wrote documentation that no one cared about except the person who would replace me. I did it perfectly, almost lovingly, because that is what I do. Each keystroke felt like chalk marking the end of a long lesson. My name would fade from memory, but the lines I left behind would be impossible to erase completely. On Thursday, I arrived early. The air was cool and damp from a night of rain, the kind that left the sidewalks shining like they had been polished. I swiped my badge at the main doors and noticed the security guard glance at me with a flicker of recognition. He had probably read the system note that my access to certain rooms had been temporarily restricted. That was the official phrase. Temporarily restricted. It meant you no longer belong where decisions are made. I walked past the glass conference room where Carter was already inside with his hand-picked circle. They were laughing at something on his phone. Their laughter was loud enough to leak through the glass and ride the air toward me. I did not pause. I went to my desk and opened a clean document. I began outlining a transition guide for onboarding processes, the kind of tedious but necessary material that would outlive all of us. At 11, Sarah walked by. She stopped, hesitated, and then leaned down. Her voice was low. "It will not always be like this." I looked at her and wondered if she believed it or if she only wanted me to. Either way, the sentence was kind. I nodded. "Thank you." She squeezed my shoulder lightly and moved on. The rest of the day passed with deliberate slowness. I checked every box on my list. Export histories, photograph properties, archive emails. Each action was a stitch in a fabric I would soon wrap around myself for protection. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the contract again. I read the clause until I knew every syllable by heart. Rejected proposals with no material investment are not considered company property. Independent creation must be demonstrable. I had the proof. I had the sequence of drafts, the messages, the dates. I had even the napkin sketch from weeks before the meeting, folded at the back of my notebook. The city outside my window pulsed with its usual rhythm, but I was already listening to a different rhythm. The slow, insistent beat of an idea that refused to die just because someone laughed at it. By Friday, Carter's campaign against me reached its quiet peak. Derek, the new hire, came again, this time clutching a list of questions he clearly did not understand. He asked me about predictive metrics. He asked me what signals matter most. He said Carter wanted him to take over the work I used to do. He tried to sound cheerful, but his eyes betrayed the panic of someone carrying a weight too heavy for his frame. I helped him anyway, patiently, thoroughly. I gave him a simple framework and even wrote a short guide, but on my personal device. I emailed it from my personal account, not the company one. A careful separation. When I handed him the notes, he looked embarrassed. "Carter said you'd be moving to documentation full-time. He thought you would be happy to focus on details." Happy. The word nearly made me laugh. I managed to keep my face neutral. Documentation deserves precision, I said. Precision is valuable. He nodded quickly, not realizing the double meaning. That evening, when most people left early for the weekend, I stayed. The hum of servers filled the air again. Maria appeared with her cart and gave me the same knowing smile. Working late, Miss Wren? Not much longer, I said. She tilted her head. You are different this week. Calm, but different. Maybe I finally see things clearly, I replied. She nodded as though she understood more than I said. Sometimes the people closest to the edges see the center more clearly than those at the top. I packed slowly. The cactus I had cared for sat small but sturdy on my desk. I thought about taking it with me, but I decided to wait. A plant can survive a few more weeks without knowing it is about to change owners. On the way out, I touched the badge against the sensor one more time. The door beeped open. The sound was ordinary, but I imagined a day soon when the beep would no longer belong to me. That day would not be an end. It would be the signal for something else. In the garage, I sat in my car and looked up at the building. 12 years of mornings, of late nights, of weekends sacrificed for deadlines no one remembered. 12 years of carrying other people's wins, of letting my work shine in someone else's spotlight. All of it now reduced to a smirk, a joke, a dismissal, except it was not reduced. Not really. The work lived. The data was real. The algorithm existed, beating like a second heart inside my laptop. And the contract had whispered the truth. What they rejected did not belong to them. I turned the key. The engine purred awake. The road out of the garage stretched into the city's veins. As I drove, I realized I was no longer thinking of myself as an employee clinging to a seat at their table. I was already somewhere else, in a space not yet built but possible. A space where $2,000 was not an indulgence but an opening bet. The week had begun with humiliation. It ended with clarity. The difference between the two was a single sentence in a document most people would never read carefully. A sentence that told me the future was mine if I had the courage to claim it. Monday morning began like any other, but it was not the same. Something invisible had shifted. I could feel it before I even swiped my badge at the lobby turnstile. The guard nodded politely, but his eyes lingered a second too long on the screen that displayed my access profile. I tried to convince myself I was imagining it. Still, when I walked through the glass doors of the floor, the first thing I noticed was that my badge no longer opened the executive conference room. The small red light blinked twice, a flat refusal. For 12 years, my badge had always opened that door. Now the system said no. System glitch, the security technician said when I called. He did not sound surprised, almost like he had practiced the answer. Someone will fix it. But later, when I passed by, Carter's chosen circle walked in without hesitation. No red light for them. The change was subtle but unmistakable. They were telling me without telling me, you do not belong here. At 8:30 sharp, my calendar pinged. A product strategy meeting had just been rescheduled. The new time was the exact slot when I had a standing call with our partners in Dublin. Everyone knew that call was immovable, tied to time zones and commitments across the ocean. I stared at the new invitation on my screen. It felt deliberate, like someone had moved the chessboard by a single square to knock over my piece. I accepted anyway. That was my habit. Accept first, argue later. But in this case, I knew there would be no point in arguing. Carter had found another way to thin the ground beneath me. The rest of the morning crawled. I opened my documentation assignments, rewriting old onboarding flows, fixing outdated links. It was work that mattered to no one, yet I poured precision into every sentence. The habit of doing things right clung to me, even when I knew no one would notice. Around noon, I walked to the cafeteria. The tables were half full, clusters of colleagues leaning in over trays. I could feel the small silences that opened when I passed. People lowered their voices. No one met my eyes directly. I carried my salad to a corner table and ate slowly, chewing without tasting. Halfway through, Sarah slid into the seat across from me. She did not waste time with pleasantries. "They are moving you out," she said softly. I set my fork down. "I know." "You should fight," she whispered. "Fight who?" I asked. "The system, the circle around Carter, the executives who already decided where loyalty belongs." She looked down at her tray. "I hate this." I wanted to tell her it was fine, that I was fine, but the words felt too much like a lie. Instead, I thanked her for saying something when most people chose silence. She nodded and returned to her team, her shoulders tight. The afternoon brought another small cut. My access to the analytics platform returned a message I had never seen before: pending review. I sent a polite request for support. The automated reply promised assistance within 72 hours. I did not believe it would ever come. I watched the cursor blink on the empty search bar. I had lived inside that system for years, reading patterns like stories. Now the system itself was telling me, "You are no longer welcome here." I filled the rest of the day with notes, guides, transition documents. If they wanted to push me into irrelevance, then at least I would leave no loose threads. That was my quiet rebellion, order in the face of dismissal. When I left that evening, the sky had already darkened. The building's glass reflected the city lights, turning each window into a square of borrowed brightness. I stood outside for a long time, watching people come and go. None of them noticed me. That, I realized, was exactly the point. The next morning began with another reminder. An email from Monica in HR, politely requesting a quick check-in. I walked into her small office where a succulent sat perfectly staged on the desk. She smiled in a way that felt rehearsed. "Ren," she began, "we have had some concerns raised about your collaborative approach." The phrasing made me laugh inside. Collaborative approach. In other words, you are not falling in line. "Concerns?" I asked. "Several team members feel you have been resistant to new leadership directions," she said, folding her hands neatly. I kept my voice calm. "I presented one proposal. Once." She tilted her head sympathetically. "It is not about frequency. It is about attitude. We need team players who understand that innovation requires enthusiasm for the collective vision." Collective vision. Corporate code for silence and obedience. "I have 18 successful launches behind me," I said softly. "Retention strategies that saved millions." She smiled tighter. "We appreciate your past contributions, but the company is evolving. You may want to reflect on whether your style fits our culture moving forward." I nodded once. The message was clear. Leave quietly. Spare us the trouble of severance. When I walked out of her office, the hallway felt narrower. Even the posters about bold innovation seemed to mock me. The words on the glossy paper read, "Every voice matters." I nearly tore it down, but I did not. I kept walking. That afternoon, Carter appeared near my desk with his mug. He leaned against the partition like he owned the air around him. "Adaptability," he said casually, "is the key to innovation." I did not reply. Silence was safer than any answer. He smirked and walked away. By the end of the week, the picture was undeniable. I was no longer part of product channels on Slack. My permissions had quietly vanished overnight. Colleagues spoke around me, not to me. When conversations shifted to future initiatives, no one turned in my direction. I became invisible. The irony was sharp. My proposal had been about predicting when users would leave before they did. And now, I was watching the company predict me out of existence. That Friday evening, when the floor emptied, I stayed behind again. I opened the agreement one more time, my eyes falling to the clause that had become my lifeline. Rejected proposals, no financial investment, not company property. It was a sentence written years ago by some lawyer who would never know how it would save me. I closed my eyes and imagined a future outside these walls. A future where the laughter from that meeting no longer echoed like a scar. A future where $2,000 would not be laughed at, but invested in. The building was silent, the servers humming like a chorus. I whispered to myself, "They are pushing me out, but they do not realize they are pushing me forward." And for the first time in weeks, the words felt true. The following Monday, I arrived earlier than usual, thinking maybe the quiet would help. But even in the stillness of 7:30, the subtle reminders had already been laid out for me. My desk phone had been moved slightly, angled differently than how I always left it. Someone had been there. A sticky note with a smiley face was on my chair, written in a handwriting I did not recognize. I picked it up, turned it over, and tossed it into the trash. A small thing, but the kind of small thing meant to remind you of your place. When the office filled, Carter strolled past in his usual way, sipping coffee as though the entire floor belonged to him. He stopped by the new hire's desk, clapped him on the shoulder, and spoke in a voice loud enough for half the room to hear. "We are counting on you to lead analytics, Derek. Big responsibility. Big chance to prove yourself." I watched Derek's face shift between pride and panic. He glanced toward me but quickly looked away, as if eye contact itself might get him in trouble. By mid-morning, my email pinged with another reassignment. A set of transition documents had been placed in my queue, tasks usually reserved for interns. When I opened the ticket, the request was tagged with Carter's name. He wanted me to rewrite a basic troubleshooting manual that had been out of date for years. It was busy work, and we both knew it. I completed it anyway. Not sloppily, not bitterly. I wrote it with the same thoroughness I would give to anything else, because I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me falter. If they wanted to pretend I was only capable of writing manuals, then I would write a manual so flawless it would mock their underestimation. Around lunch, Sarah messaged me privately. "Let's step outside for a walk." We met in the plaza beneath the building, where a fountain splashed cheerfully in contrast to the conversations that weighed both of us down. "They are trying to make you quit," she said, blunt as always. "Yes," I answered. "It is easier that way, no severance, no questions." She hesitated. "Do you have a plan?" I looked at the water, the way it arced upward and then broke into spray. "I have the truth, that is enough for now." She nodded, but her eyes stayed troubled. She wanted to ask more, I could tell, but loyalty had limits in this place. We walked back in silence. By Wednesday, the exclusions were no longer subtle. My calendar was full of meetings I was not actually invited to attend. I would get the notifications, then watch as the rooms filled without my presence. When I asked about one particularly important strategy session, Carter smiled and said, "Oh, we thought it would be more efficient to keep it small." Efficient. That word echoed long after he walked away. Efficient meant without me. That evening, I stayed later than everyone else again. The office at night had become a second home, a place where I could finally breathe without performing. I opened the archives of old projects, scrolling through names and dates, remembering the launches that had defined my career. Each one had my fingerprints, my analysis, my insight, but the documents only carried the company logo, never my name. I thought about the young woman who had started here 12 years ago, who believed merit would be enough. She had worked late not because anyone told her to, but because she wanted to understand more than others. That woman had been erased gradually, stroke by stroke, until only the documentation expert remained. But she was still here, somewhere inside, and she was beginning to sharpen again. I began organizing my personal evidence more systematically. Folders with dates, screenshots with clear timestamps, notes documenting the meeting where Carter laughed at me. Witness lists of who had been present. Each piece of evidence was like laying bricks for a structure no one else could see yet. On Friday morning, I found Derek waiting awkwardly at my desk. He held a printout in his hands. "Ren," he began, "Carter asked me to take over the user behavior project you used to handle. He said you would walk me through it before you transition to your new role." I raised an eyebrow. "My new role?" He flushed, realizing what he had just revealed. "I thought you knew." "Documentation, full-time," that is what he said. The words should have cut. Instead, they clarified. Carter had already written me out. I smiled, though the smile did not reach my eyes. "Of course, let me show you the system." For 2 hours I walked him through basics, patient as a teacher, methodical as a surgeon. He struggled. His notes were messy, his questions frantic. I answered them all. Then, quietly, I created a detailed guide for him using my personal laptop. A clean document that explained every simple step, but none of the deeper architecture. I gave him enough to survive, not enough to build what I had built. When he thanked me, his gratitude was genuine. I did not hold his inexperience against him. He was a pawn, not the player moving pieces. That night, when the floor was empty, I sat at my desk and stared at the glowing monitor. I should have felt broken. Instead, I felt steady. The more they pushed me away, the more they freed me to claim what was mine. I pulled out the printed clause again, the one from the contract. I read it slowly, word by word, letting each syllable confirm my next step. They thought they were burying me under humiliation, but they were actually clearing the ground for my escape. By the end of that week, I knew the game had changed. They were dismantling my position piece by piece, but I was building something invisible in return. A plan, a certainty. A door waiting to be opened. And though they believed they were forcing me out into nothingness, I had already begun to see what lay on the other side. A place where laughter in a conference room would no longer matter, where $2,000 would no longer be dismissed as small thinking, where my work could finally speak louder than anyone's voice. I walked out of the building that Friday evening with a calm I had not felt in months. The city glowed gold in the fading light. For the first time in a long time, the future did not scare me. It called to me. The weekend was quiet, but my mind refused to rest. The apartment felt smaller than usual, walls pressing in with every memory of the past week. Carter's smirk, Derek's anxious glance, the cafeteria whispers, they all replayed, but this time they served a different purpose. They were not humiliations. They were clues, signals. I pulled the contract from the file box again, unfolding it slowly so the crease lines caught the soft morning light. My eyes skimmed the pages mechanically, but when I reached the schedule on proposals, I froze. There it was, clear as a beacon: any proposal submitted and rejected, for which no material company investment was made, does not belong to the company, provided the employee can prove independent authorship. I blinked. One line, innocuous in appearance, yet capable of tearing apart 12 years of invisible servitude. I read it twice more, letting the meaning settle like sediment in water. They had tried to erase me, to push me into a corner, and in doing so, they had revealed a door. A door only I could walk through. I opened my drafts folder and lined up the sequence of files. The earliest note, typed at 6 a.m. on a Sunday, the rough outline of predictive signals, saved on my personal drive. Then the algorithm code, tested and refined overnights with coffee and silence. Every iteration time-stamped, every update cleanly labeled. Everything was mine. I allowed myself a brief smile, not a triumphant one, just a quiet acknowledgement. The game had changed. Monday morning arrived with a familiar gray drizzle. The city streets glistened under the overhangs of street lamps, and I walked to the office, briefcase in hand, determination tightening my spine. I passed the glass doors and noticed Carter standing near the elevator, holding his mug. He gave a faint nod, the kind of gesture meant to assert dominance, yet lacking any real weight. I returned the nod lightly, letting calm settle over me like armor. I settled at my desk and began cataloging everything systematically. Screenshots of slides from the meeting where my proposal had been laughed at. Emails confirming that no resources were assigned. Notes on what was done in personal time versus company time. Witness lists of who was present when decisions were made. Every detail meticulously recorded. Every fact verifiable. By mid-morning, I realized the magnitude of what I held. The same company that had dismissed me now had no claim over the idea that had sparked the laughter, the dismissal, the subtle exclusion. They had inadvertently preserved my ownership. Lunch came and went. I barely noticed the cafeteria, barely noticed the gossiping clusters of employees. My thoughts were elsewhere. I drafted a plan, not yet for investors or partners, just for myself. Steps to solidify my independent creation. Steps to extract the work safely without violating policy. Steps to reclaim agency. Carter's voice floated over from the conference room. We need to focus on deliverables for next quarter. He spoke as though he were the sun, and everything revolved around him. I let the words pass without reaction. I did not need deliverables, not anymore. I needed freedom. By mid-afternoon, I had my checklist fully written. Print every draft, photograph time-stamped code, export all test results, compile version history, email a copy to myself for legal verification, use timestamp services. The steps were mundane but necessary. Each checked box strengthened the foundation of the exit I was about to make. Evening came. The floor emptied like water draining from a bath. The fluorescent lights hummed softly. I went over the plan again. The quiet allowed me to hear myself think. The humiliation of the meeting faded, replaced by clarity. I was no longer a pawn in someone else's hierarchy. I was a player with a strategy of my own. I walked to the kitchenette and poured tea, letting the steam warm my hands. Each sip reinforced the steady rhythm of decision. I would not storm out in anger. I would not take anything that was not rightfully mine. I would leave only with what I could prove was mine, and that was enough. When I returned to my desk, I opened the first file, the earliest version of the algorithm. I traced the logic, verifying that everything could be accounted for independently. Notes, screenshots, drafts, emails, timestamps, each a stone in the path that led away from this office and toward something new. I imagined the future. A small office with a few trusted allies. A place where my ideas would be judged on merit, not mockery. A place where $2,000 would be an opportunity, not a punchline. My heart beat steadily as the outline formed in my mind. Before leaving, I opened the drawer and pulled out the contract once more. I ran a finger along the clause, reading it aloud softly. Rejected proposals, no material investment, not company property. I repeated it twice, 3 times. It felt like chanting a spell that would make the path clear. As I turned off the lights and walked out, the city beyond the glass doors seemed less gray, less indifferent. It was alive with possibility. The first major step had been taken. I had discovered the loophole, recognized the path, and begun to walk it. The evening air hit me like a promise. Carter's smirk, the whispers, the subtle exclusions, they were no longer threats. They were the trigger. They had pushed me to look closer, to see what had always been in plain sight. For the first time in a long while, I felt the weight of anticipation replace the weight of oppression. The twist was not just in the contract. It was in me. The recognition that I could step away with everything rightfully mine. That realization was sharper than any insult, clearer than any dismissal. I walked through the city streets with purpose, mapping the next steps in my mind. I would finalize the proof. I would secure my ownership. And when the time was right, I would leave. The world outside this office would not be the same. This first step, small in the eyes of others, was monumental for me. The rejection that had hurt so deeply had, paradoxically, become my liberation. And liberation, once tasted, is impossible to ignore. Tuesday morning arrived crisp and silent. The city had a sheen of frost on the pavement, reflecting the pale sunlight through the office windows. I walked in with a sense of calm I had not felt in years. Carter was nowhere in sight, probably already ensconced in the executive floor with his chosen circle. That was fine. Today, I did not need him. I had other work to do. I opened my personal drive, double-checking the export of every draft, every email, every timestamped note. The work was meticulous, almost ritualistic. I relived the early days of the algorithm, recalling each late night and quiet weekend. Every step I had taken outside the glare of management was documented, verifiable. Each file was a stone in a path leading away from corporate suffocation and toward independence. I began labeling everything. Folder names were precise: proposal drafts, algorithm versions, meeting notes, witness statements, timeline evidence. Each item tagged with a date, a description, and a comment if clarification was needed. My hands moved with steady confidence, the rhythm meditative. What had once felt like tedious documentation now held a new weight, proof of my future. By mid-morning, I had compiled a summary document, a narrative of creation. It outlined the conception of the idea, the research supporting it, and the independent resources I had used. Every claim was backed with references, timestamps, and observable actions. It was a legal map of ownership that no one could dispute without acknowledging the obvious truth. I read it over several times, each sentence gaining clarity and strength. Lunch came and went. I ate at my desk, eyes barely leaving the screen. Outside, the street hummed with the usual traffic, but inside I felt a quiet power gathering, one that had nothing to do with promotions or recognition. It belonged to me, and it was mine alone. By afternoon, I contacted my private counsel. I attached the folder of proofs, the narrative document, and the contract clause. In the message, I outlined the situation without emotion, presenting facts only. I requested confirmation that my rights to the rejected work were secure and that my next steps could be taken without risk. I pressed send and leaned back, allowing the silence to settle around me like a protective veil. The remainder of the day was devoted to planning. I drafted a timeline of actions, secure all files, compile a final personal archive, and prepare a transition document for the work I would leave behind. I listed priorities for any communication with colleagues, ensuring that I maintained professionalism and clarity. Every detail mattered, every step deliberate. When the office cleared, I stayed late, reviewing each document for completeness. The fluorescent lights hummed softly. My own reflection in the darkened monitor reminded me of a woman who had endured 12 years of silent labor, dismissal, and exclusion. And now she was poised at the edge of autonomy. I imagined the first steps beyond the building. The small office, the laptop, the minimal initial budget. The thought of $2,000, laughed at and dismissed, now carried the weight of potential, the seed of transformation. I pictured the process of assembling a small team, sharing the vision, and presenting the algorithm in a context where merit would matter more than hierarchy. The night deepened, and the hum of the servers became a companion. I closed my eyes and let the week replay. The meeting, the dismissals, the subtle exclusions, each a push toward clarity. They had attempted to erase me, but instead they had revealed the path to independence. Every obstacle had been a guidepost, every sneer a signal pointing toward opportunity. Before leaving, I returned to the contract one last time for the evening. The clause glowed faintly in the lamplight: rejected proposals, no material investment, independent creation. I whispered the words aloud, letting them resonate in the empty office. They were not just letters on a page. They were an invitation, a key, a mandate. I shut the lights and gathered my things. The elevator ride down was quiet. The reflection of the city in the glass walls seemed less like glass and more like a mirror of possibility. My hands were steady on the rails. My mind was clear. I had endured humiliation, subtle exclusion, and dismissal. Now I had clarity, evidence, and purpose. Outside, the air was cold but invigorating. I walked to my car with deliberate steps, each one a reminder of ownership and agency. The city sprawled ahead, indifferent, but I felt no fear. Only anticipation. The first twist of fate had been mine to seize. The next would be mine to shape. I drove home slowly, reviewing each step of the plan. What remained was execution, leaving the company with dignity, protecting every asset that belonged to me, and preparing the first steps of the independent venture that would follow. My mind was a ledger of possibilities, each one carefully accounted for. When I arrived home, I set the folder on my desk. I poured a cup of tea and let it cool beside me as I reviewed the documents one last time. Every timestamp checked, every email verified, every draft accounted for. The pathway forward was secure. I looked out the window at the darkened city. The streetlights reflected on wet pavement, creating lines that seemed to stretch forever. I traced them with my eyes, imagining the trajectory of my next steps, the formation of a company built on what was mine, on what I had created. Sleep came more easily that night, not because the city was quiet, but because the weight of uncertainty had lifted. I knew my future. I had proof. I had clarity. I had freedom. When I woke the next morning, I felt a strange serenity. The first major twist, the realization of ownership and the opening of the pathway beyond the company, was no longer just a thought. It had become a reality that I could act upon. My body moved with purpose, my mind with strategy. The next phase was imminent. I would leave the company, but I would leave armed with everything that belonged to me. Nothing more, nothing less. And in doing so, I would step into a world where merit mattered, and where $2,000 could become the seed of a new beginning. The first morning outside the walls of the company felt surreal. I had not formally resigned yet, but the contract, the evidence, and the timeline were all in place. I no longer felt like an employee. I felt like someone standing on the edge of a new world, where the rules were mine to define. The streets glimmered with frost and sunlight, and the city seemed to pause, just for a moment, to watch me step into possibility. I spent that morning reviewing every piece of my work one more time. The drafts, the emails, the timelines, the screenshots. Each one meticulously labeled, dated, and backed by verifiable proof. I exported a final master folder to a secure drive, encrypted and backed up. This was the foundation of what would become Neuralink, my independent venture. I made a list of people I trusted, former colleagues, friends with technical skill, a few who had been overlooked or marginalized in the same office. Each one had potential and discretion. I began contacting them, one by one, with carefully worded messages that were straightforward but sparing in detail. No corporate names, no references to ongoing conflicts. Just an invitation to collaborate on an independent project. Responses came slowly at first. Some were wary, uncertain of leaving a stable paycheck. Others were curious, intrigued by the possibility of working on something that had no corporate hand guiding it. By the end of the day, I had secured 3 allies, engineers and analysts who had seen my work firsthand and trusted my judgment. Each one brought a unique skill, but all shared the same quiet hunger for independence and recognition. We met that evening in a small co-working space I had rented for the first month. The room was unremarkable, a rectangle with plain walls and fluorescent lights that hummed faintly. A whiteboard leaned against one wall, and a few chairs were arranged around a table. The minimalism felt liberating rather than oppressive. I opened the session with a brief outline. "This is not a corporate project," I said, voice steady. "We are building something that belongs entirely to us. It is small at first. $2,000 is enough to prove the concept, but we will think bigger. This algorithm can predict user behavior in ways the old company dismissed. That is our advantage." They listened, nodding, asking questions that were thoughtful and precise. Derek had joined me from the old company under a different context, though he did not know it yet. He had the technical skill to translate my vision into executable code. Another, Lena, specialized in data pipelines and systems integration. And Marco, who had been in product analytics for years, understood the nuances of predictive models in a way that made him indispensable. We sketched ideas on the whiteboard: flowcharts, architecture, data sources, test plans. Every line drawn was deliberate. Every question considered carefully. This was our sandbox, free from the constraints of hierarchy or office politics. We were equal in purpose and skill, united by the desire to create. By nightfall, we had a roadmap. First, a minimal viable product. Second, testing with synthetic datasets to ensure validity. Third, a controlled pilot with selected clients once the MVP proved robust, each step carefully timed and executed. The timeline extended over weeks, but each week had milestones. For the first time in months, I felt the thrill of possibility rather than the tension of suppression. I returned home that night and reviewed the documents I had prepared for legal verification. Every timestamp, every file, every step of development was recorded. I considered the implications. If anything went wrong, I wanted proof that the work was mine and mine alone. It was not paranoia. It was preparation. I slept with the faint hum of the city outside my window. When I dreamed, it was of lines of code forming pathways and bridges, connecting one idea to another. Each bridge was a choice, each pathway a possibility. I woke with the sense that the world outside the office was not waiting for me to catch up. It was waiting for me to build. The following day, I made my first outreach to potential investors. I had compiled a concise presentation: the problem, the proposed solution, the algorithm, and the potential market impact. I kept it simple, avoiding technical jargon that could obscure the core message. The slide deck was clean and elegant, emphasizing clarity over decoration. I sent the deck to a small angel investment network, including a personal note. I did not exaggerate. I did not embellish. I presented facts and vision, the combination that always carries more weight than hyperbole. Responses were slow at first, a mix of curiosity and polite dismissal. Then one reply stood out: a short email from a firm specializing in early-stage tech investments. They requested a video call. The subject line read simply, "Interesting proposal. Let's discuss." The thrill was tangible. It was the first recognition outside the confines of the old company that the idea had value. I shared the news with the team, and their eyes lit up in the fluorescent co-working space. The energy shifted. It was no longer about escape. It was about creation. Over the next days, we worked relentlessly. Code reviews, data simulations, algorithm tuning. Every iteration improved the predictive accuracy. Every bug fixed felt like reclaiming a piece of dignity. My small team became cohesive, efficient, and motivated. The old office politics were gone, replaced with mutual respect and shared purpose. By the end of the week, I had prepared for the investor call. Notes meticulously organized, projections validated, questions anticipated. I would present, but more importantly, I would show that $2,000 could be transformed into something significant with the right guidance. The night before the call, I stood by my apartment window, looking down at the city lights. For the first time, I did not feel small. I did not feel diminished. I felt capable, and that capability was mine to direct. The first tangible step into the world beyond the office had been taken. The morning of the investor call arrived with clear skies and a crisp breeze. I woke early, anticipating the meeting with a quiet intensity that steadied my pulse. Every piece of the deck had been checked and rechecked. Every projection verified. Every talking point rehearsed. The team gathered in the small co-working space, laptops ready, notebooks open. "I know we can do this," I said, looking at each of them. "The work is solid. The numbers are clear. The vision is ours. Remember, we are presenting what is already true." They nodded, their faces reflecting a mixture of excitement and nerves. Derek adjusted his laptop, Lena reviewed the charts one last time, Marco ran through a simulation silently in his mind. Together, we were a small unit, concentrated, focused, and ready. The video call connected, and the investors appeared on the screen, their faces framed by bookshelves and office lighting. They introduced themselves quickly, a group of 3, each with a different style, one analytical and direct, another more casual, curious, and the third skeptical, leaning back with arms crossed. I began with the introduction, clear, concise, factual. I explained the problem: user churn, inefficiencies in predictive modeling, lost opportunities. I showed how our algorithm predicted user behavior with high accuracy, using a pilot dataset carefully constructed to demonstrate potential. The slides transitioned smoothly. Graphs, projections, examples. I spoke slowly, confidently, allowing them to absorb each point. The analytical investor leaned forward. "Your approach is solid. How does your model scale to larger datasets? And what about edge cases where users behave unpredictably?" I had anticipated this question. "The algorithm is modular. Edge cases are flagged, logged, and incorporated into learning cycles. As the dataset grows, the predictive capability improves without compromising accuracy. We have tested scalability on simulated datasets that are 5 times the size of typical company data." The curious investor asked, "How do you ensure privacy and compliance while collecting the data?" I explained the safeguards, encryption, anonymization protocols, and strict adherence to legal standards. Compliance is built in. It is not an afterthought. This is critical not just for legality but for trust and adoption. The skeptical investor remained quiet for a long moment. Then he asked, $2,000 requested for a pilot. It seems modest for the potential. Why such a small initial investment? I smiled faintly. Because our goal is to demonstrate proof of concept efficiently. The small investment minimizes risk, accelerates validation, and allows us to pivot quickly. What matters is the data, not the initial dollar amount. A small sum can reveal large truths. The investors exchanged glances. Their skepticism softened, curiosity taking its place. Questions continued, each more precise than the last. I responded with confidence, referring to charts, data, and pilot results. Each answer built credibility. Each slide reinforced the message. This idea was both sound and actionable. By the end of the session, one of the investors leaned closer to the screen. We would like to meet in person. Let's discuss the next phase. Relief and quiet excitement rippled through the team. Lena allowed herself a smile. Derek exhaled slowly. Marco's eyes gleamed with determination. I closed my laptop and leaned back, letting the moment sink in. The first external validation had arrived. The next week was consumed with refining the MVP. Every line of code, every test scenario, every minor adjustment was approached with precision. We worked late nights, drinking tea and coffee, driven not by fear but by purpose. The office became our incubator, a space where merit replaced hierarchy, where innovation was measured by results rather than approval. I documented every improvement, linking each update to the previous iteration. The algorithm learned faster than I anticipated, and the test results exceeded initial expectations. Derek became more confident, making small enhancements independently. Lena ensured that the system was stable and scalable. Marco focused on visualization and interpretation of predictions, turning raw data into actionable insights. By the end of the second week, the MVP was ready for a controlled pilot. I selected a small number of external participants, individuals or companies who could provide meaningful feedback without exposing proprietary data. Each participant signed confidentiality agreements, and the pilot was executed with strict adherence to ethical and legal standards. The results were promising. Retention predictions matched actual behavior with remarkable accuracy. Patterns emerged that had previously been invisible. The pilot demonstrated not just feasibility, but potential for significant market impact. As the team celebrated quietly, I reflected on the journey. The humiliation and exclusion I had endured had sharpened my focus. The corporate office that had tried to erase me had unwittingly created the conditions for my independence. $2,000, dismissed and laughed at, had become the seed for this emerging reality. By the end of the month, communication with the investors intensified. Follow-up calls, data presentations, and discussions about potential investment and expansion filled our calendar. Their interest was genuine, measured, and increasingly enthusiastic. Each conversation reinforced the potential they saw, a reflection of the work we had accomplished in private, away from dismissive eyes. The team was energized, bonded by shared purpose and mutual respect. What had been silent exclusion had transformed into empowerment. I observed the small gestures of collaboration, the thoughtful questions, the quiet celebrations over small victories. This was not just work, this was creation. On a quiet evening, I sat alone reviewing the timeline, every step meticulously logged, every milestone validated. The next phase, funding, market introduction, and expansion, was in motion. I allowed myself a moment of reflection. 12 years of suppression had culminated in this quiet, powerful awakening. The algorithm, the data, the people, all were aligned, ready to move forward. I looked out the window at the city, its lights reflecting in puddles from a recent rain. The skyline was a patchwork of possibility, each building representing decisions, choices, and visions. For the first time, I felt entirely capable, unbound by the constraints of the old company. The twist had carried me here. What had been dismissed, excluded, and undervalued was now the foundation of something greater. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that this was only the beginning. The morning light fell softly on the co-working space, illuminating whiteboards full of diagrams, notes, and plans. For the first time, I felt the thrill of looking at our collective work without the weight of judgment pressing down from above. The pilot results had exceeded expectations, and now, the first external recognition was arriving. I sat at the table with Derek, Lena, and Marco, the three faces of our fledgling venture. The screen displayed the email from the lead investor. They were impressed, and they wanted to schedule an in-person meeting to discuss the next round of funding. The words were simple but potent. We see promise, clarity, and strong execution. We want to learn more. A quiet cheer rippled through the team. Lena smiled, the kind of smile that releases months of tension in a single exhale. Derek shook his head in disbelief, his fingers hovering over the keyboard, unsure if he should begin planning the presentation or just sit and enjoy the moment. Marco's eyes glimmered, scanning the message with meticulous attention, already thinking ahead to how we would frame the data for the meeting. I closed my laptop and looked around at them. "We earned this," I said softly. "Not by luck, not by permission, but by focusing on the work, doing it right, and staying true to the vision." They nodded. The energy in the room was different now. It was no longer about reaction, about survival. It was about creation, about building something real, something tangible, something that could stand on its own. The next few days were a flurry of preparation. We rehearsed the presentation multiple times, refining the slides, clarifying explanations, anticipating every question the investors might ask. I insisted on precision, clarity, and honesty. There would be no exaggeration, no embellishment, just the facts, the results, and the vision. Each session brought the team closer. Questions were answered collectively, suggestions were debated respectfully, mistakes were corrected without blame. The dynamic was unfamiliar but invigorating. In the old office, hierarchy dictated behavior. Here, merit guided action. And merit, when recognized, created a bond stronger than authority. The day of the meeting arrived. I wore a simple suit, professional yet unassuming, a deliberate choice to focus attention on the work rather than the presenter. The co-working space was quiet, the team seated around the table, laptops ready. The investors appeared on the screen, and introductions were brief. I began with the problem statement, highlighting the inefficiencies in predictive models and the cost of missed insights. I walked them through the algorithm, its predictive capacity, and the pilot results. The data spoke clearly. Patterns, correlations, and projections were presented without hyperbole, yet the narrative conveyed potential and opportunity. Questions were posed. I answered them directly, with supporting evidence from our pilot and simulations. The analytical investor leaned forward. "This is compelling. How do you plan to scale?" I explained the architecture, the modular design, and the plan for incremental expansion. We have validated the approach with a controlled pilot. Scaling will involve integrating additional datasets and refining algorithms iteratively. The foundation is sound, and the design supports growth without compromising accuracy. The curious investor asked about privacy. I outlined the encryption protocols, anonymization standards, and regulatory compliance. Each response reinforced credibility. I could see their skepticism easing, replaced by genuine interest. By the end of the hour, they expressed desire to proceed with the next phase, a larger pilot and discussion of funding. Their enthusiasm was tempered with caution, but it was real, measured, and promising. After the call, the team exhaled collectively. Lena leaned back in her chair. "We did it. It feels real now." Derek shook his head. "I can't believe this. From a small pilot to actual investor interest, it is like we are finally visible." Marco smiled quietly. "We are visible because the work speaks for itself, not because anyone else noticed." I allowed myself a small smile. The sense of vindication I had anticipated was present, but it was tempered by purpose. The goal had never been revenge. The goal had always been creation. And now, the world was beginning to acknowledge it. Over the next week, I began planning a public announcement of the pilot's success, carefully considering language, timing, and scope. The recognition was modest but deliberate. A newsletter for industry insiders, a small press release, and selective social media updates highlighting the algorithm's predictive success without revealing proprietary details. The response was encouraging. Messages from colleagues, old acquaintances, and other industry professionals arrived, acknowledging the innovation and the potential impact. Some offered collaboration, others congratulations. The validation, while external, resonated with the team. Each note and comment reinforced the legitimacy of what we were building. I also took time to reflect privately. The humiliation, the exclusion, the subtle attempts to erase me, all of it had forged resilience, patience, and precision. The first external recognition was not the end. It was a milestone, a marker on the path toward full autonomy and growth. By Friday, the first investors requested a follow-up meeting to discuss expansion. The excitement in the team was palpable. We prepared meticulously, reviewing every slide, every dataset, every potential question. The stakes were higher now, but so was our confidence. We had proven our capability. The proof was visible. That evening, I walked through the city streets alone, thinking about the journey from rejection to recognition. The city lights reflected on wet pavements, a mirror of opportunity. The first tangible acknowledgement of our work had arrived, and it felt like a threshold being crossed. The week ended with a quiet sense of momentum. The pilot's success had not solved all challenges, but it had confirmed that the approach worked, that the team could operate independently, and that investors were willing to take notice. For the first time, I felt the trajectory of possibility rather than the weight of suppression. Sitting in the quiet of the co-working space, I allowed myself a small measure of satisfaction. The journey was just beginning. The algorithm, the team, and the vision were all aligned. The external recognition was only the first step in establishing a new narrative, one in which merit, persistence, and intelligence were recognized and rewarded. Monday arrived with the crisp scent of early autumn in the city. I entered the co-working space earlier than usual, carrying a folder with updated pilot results and projections for the next phase. The team had arrived a few minutes before me, laptops open, screens flickering, energy focused and quiet. I smiled at them. Today is about clarity. We will outline our next steps and demonstrate that we can handle scaling responsibly and effectively. Derek nodded, fingers poised over the keyboard. Lena reviewed the latest performance metrics. Marco was sketching visualizations for the data dashboard. The team moved with synchronized purpose, each aware of their role yet engaged in the collective vision. The call with investors began precisely at 10. Their faces appeared on the screen, composed but attentive. I greeted each of them and summarized the pilot results, highlighting the accuracy, the predictive patterns, and the potential for scaling to broader datasets. The analytical investor leaned forward. These results are encouraging. What steps will you take to ensure reliability under full deployment? I explained the iterative testing plan, the modularity of the system, and the measures for monitoring and correcting anomalies. Each stage will be validated independently. Any irregularity triggers a review before integration. The system is designed to learn incrementally while remaining robust. The curious investor asked about potential adoption challenges. I detailed strategies for onboarding clients, ensuring data privacy, and creating transparent reporting mechanisms. Each response was grounded in data and in our pilot experience. The skeptical investor raised a question about timelines and deliverables. I presented a phased roadmap with clear milestones. We will begin with controlled expansion, incorporating feedback at each step. By the end of the quarter, we aim to have a verified, scalable system ready for wider deployment. The structure allows for adjustments without compromising performance. The discussion continued for nearly 2 hours, covering technical, financial, and operational aspects. I answered each question with clarity, supporting statements with visualizations, pilot results, and documented procedures. The investors exchanged glances. Their skepticism softened into acknowledgement. By the end of the call, they were ready to commit. We would like to proceed with funding for the next phase, the analytical investor said. We see both the potential and the discipline in your approach. Let's formalize this and discuss the terms. The team exhaled collectively, relief and excitement mingling in the quiet room. Lena leaned back in her chair. We did it, she said softly. Derek's eyes widened with disbelief. Marco allowed himself a faint smile. And I felt a calm satisfaction, the kind that comes from knowing your work is validated through merit, not favoritism. The next week was a whirlwind of activity. Legal agreements with investors were reviewed and finalized. Bank accounts were set up, budgets allocated, and the workspace reorganized to accommodate additional team members joining the project. Each task reinforced the reality that Neuralink was no longer a concept. It was a growing entity with tangible support and recognition. We began the first phase of expansion. Additional datasets were integrated into the algorithm, new testing scenarios were introduced, and refinement of predictive models continued. Each iteration improved accuracy, efficiency, and reliability. The team worked late into the night, but the fatigue was different now. It was productive exhaustion, fueled by purpose rather than frustration. I documented every step meticulously. Every adjustment, every enhancement, every testing scenario was logged with timestamps and notes. This was more than record-keeping. It was establishing accountability, credibility, and traceability. I knew that transparency would be a critical asset for investors, clients, and the long-term viability of the company. During this period, I received messages from former colleagues, curious about the venture and its early success. Some offered congratulations, others sought collaboration. I responded professionally, maintaining discretion while acknowledging interest. The recognition, both internal and external, became a subtle but powerful reinforcement of our legitimacy. By the end of the month, Neuralink had demonstrated measurable success. Pilot clients reported improved insights, actionable predictions, and tangible benefits. The algorithm's performance metrics were verified independently, confirming our results and supporting investor confidence. The team gathered in the co-working space late one evening, reviewing reports and discussing next steps. I looked around at them and felt a surge of gratitude. Derek had grown in confidence, contributing technical improvements independently. Lena ensured stability and scalability with precision and foresight. Marco had transformed raw data into clear, actionable visualizations that reinforced our findings. Each member was integral, each contribution critical. I allowed myself a quiet moment of reflection. 12 years of suppression, subtle exclusion, and dismissal had culminated in this. The algorithm, once dismissed in a corporate conference room, was now recognized for its value. The $2,000 laughed at had become the seed for a growing venture. The evening ended with a short walk outside, the city lights reflected on wet streets from a brief rain. The air was sharp, clear, and invigorating. I breathed deeply, savoring the moment. The journey from dismissal to recognition had been deliberate, measured, and grounded in evidence. It was proof that merit, patience, and perseverance could overcome barriers of hierarchy, politics, and skepticism. Back in the workspace, I closed my laptop and looked around. The quiet hum of activity, the soft glow of monitors, and the focused energy of the team created a sense of stability and possibility. Neuralink was no longer a fledgling concept. It was a tangible entity moving forward, validated externally, and poised for further growth. I allowed myself a small smile. The first phase of success was complete, but the journey had only just begun. The foundation was laid. The vision was clear. And the team, aligned and motivated, was ready to take the next steps. The morning air was crisp as I arrived at the building, though not as an employee. The glass doors reflected my reflection, framed against the city beyond. The office that had once constrained me now seemed smaller, its corridors familiar but irrelevant. Today, I was coming not to submit, not to conform, but to confront. The investors had asked to observe the bid presentation at the same time the company scheduled a strategy pitch. My company, Neuralink, would compete directly with my old employer. The irony was not lost on me. The same people who had laughed at $2,000 now sat across the table from the outcome of that dismissed idea. I walked to the meeting room early, accompanied by Derek, Lena, and Marco. Each of them carried their own nervous excitement, tempered by preparation. I had rehearsed our presentation countless times, anticipating every question, every point of challenge, every skeptical glance. I felt calm, precise, and ready. When we entered the room, the familiar faces were there. Carter, seated at the head of the table with the smirk I had seen countless times, barely acknowledged my presence. Other executives shuffled papers, exchanged quiet remarks, and avoided eye contact. Their dismissive posture contrasted sharply with the energy of my team. I greeted the investors first, then the old team. "Good morning," I said, voice steady. "I appreciate you all taking the time to review the proposal." Carter responded with a nod that was more habitual than courteous. "We are interested to hear how you plan to deliver results," he said, his tone measured but slightly condescending. I began the presentation, moving smoothly between slides, data, and pilot results. The algorithm's predictive capacity, its accuracy, and the demonstrated impact on retention were laid out clearly. Every figure, every graph, and every insight had been verified independently. The executives listened, some shifting in discomfort. Carter leaned back, arms crossed, but his expression betrayed a flicker of doubt. He had seen my work in a corporate context before, but never at this level of proof and autonomy. I guided the investors and the room through each scenario. The comparisons were subtle but revealing. Where the old company's model relied on assumptions and historical data, Neuralink's system adapted in real time, analyzing microbehaviors and predicting outcomes with precision. The analytical investor leaned forward. "The results speak for themselves. How do you plan to scale this for enterprise clients?" I explained the architecture, the iterative testing, and the modular expansion plan. Each answer demonstrated not only technical understanding but strategic foresight. The skeptical faces of former colleagues began to soften as data and logic replaced assumptions. Midway through, I paused to let a key chart settle in their minds. Retention predictions against actual user behavior. The old company's model lagged behind, whereas ours matched almost perfectly. I watched their reactions carefully. Some shifted uncomfortably. Carter's eyes narrowed slightly. The faint smirk was gone. I continued, introducing visualizations that illustrated predictive insights in ways they had never seen. This is the result of focused iteration, independent creation, and careful testing, I said. It is scalable, accurate, and actionable. Questions came quickly. How do you handle anomalies? What about data privacy at scale? How do you ensure ROI for enterprise clients? I answered each with evidence, projections, and pilot outcomes. There was no exaggeration, no rhetoric. Only clarity. By the end of the presentation, the investors were nodding. "This is impressive," one said. "We see significant potential." I turned to the executives from my old company. The room was silent except for the hum of the projector. Their faces betrayed realization. The work they had dismissed, the project they had rejected, and the employee they had marginalized were now fully validated. The power dynamic had shifted, almost imperceptibly, but completely. Carter finally spoke. "This is unexpected," he said. His voice lacked certainty. "Your results are stronger than anticipated." I allowed a quiet, controlled smile. "I would say the proof has always been there," I replied. "It just needed the right environment to grow." The investors nodded approvingly. The room held its breath. The confrontation was not about humiliation. It was about undeniable merit. And in this moment, the truth was evident. The project belonged to me. The vision had been realized. The meeting continued with discussions of terms, scaling, and client implementation. My team answered technical questions, demonstrated system reliability, and outlined milestones. The contrast between Neuralink and the old company became apparent not through words alone, but through the clarity of results and the coherence of the presentation. By the conclusion, the room had shifted. Skepticism had given way to acknowledgement. The dismissive smirks were replaced by thoughtful consideration. Carter's posture was no longer assured. He understood, finally, the cost of underestimating ideas and individuals. After the investors concluded their notes and questions, I concluded the session with measured confidence. "We are ready to execute," I said. "The pathway is clear, and the results are proven. The opportunity is tangible." The investors exchanged final remarks, confirming interest and commitment. The old company representatives gathered their notes, leaving without confrontation, their silence a tacit acknowledgement of the outcome. As we packed up, I felt the quiet satisfaction of resolution. 12 years of dismissal, exclusion, and subtle undermining had led to this decisive moment. The algorithm, the evidence, the team, and the planning had converged to create an undeniable reality. I looked around at Derek, Lena, and Marco. "This is only the beginning," I said. Their eyes met mine with shared understanding. We had proven capability. We had achieved recognition. The next steps would be growth, but the foundation was undeniable. The day unfolded with an intensity that left little room for distraction. Our team arrived at the client's site early, laptops, charts, and notes in hand. The conference room, sleek and modern, reflected polished surfaces and glass walls. Across from us sat the executives from my former company, their expressions a mixture of anticipation, disbelief, and guarded skepticism. I took a deep breath, letting the energy of the moment settle in. Derek, Lena, and Marco were calm, focused, prepared. I felt the weight of 12 years of dismissal and exclusion lift, replaced by a quiet determination. This was no longer about proving anything to myself alone. This was about demonstrating unequivocally that merit, careful planning, and hard work are indisputable. The presentation began. I outlined the predictive algorithm, the results of the pilot, and the observed retention patterns. The slides were clear, precise, and methodically laid out. Each claim was supported with documented evidence and verified metrics. The investors nodded, jotting notes, clearly impressed. Across the table, the former executives watched in silence. Carter sat with his arms crossed, his usual smirk replaced by a tight-lipped concentration. It was evident that they had underestimated what we had built. The small, dismissed idea had transformed into a system capable of outperforming their predictions and insights. I paused at the key slide showing a side-by-side comparison of projected retention using the old company's model versus Neuralink's algorithm. The difference was stark. The old model lagged, producing inaccurate predictions and failing to capture subtle user behavior shifts. Our system predicted outcomes accurately, providing actionable insights in real time. One of the investors leaned forward. "This is compelling. Can you explain how this system would scale for enterprise-level deployment while maintaining accuracy?" I explained the architecture and modular design, emphasizing the incremental scaling strategy and automated anomaly detection. Each explanation was supported by data and prior pilot results. The investors' interest deepened, their skepticism giving way to admiration for the rigor and precision we had demonstrated. Carter cleared his throat. "We can match some of these outcomes," he said cautiously, his tone less confident than usual. I allowed a brief pause before replying. "Perhaps, but the results you see here are live, tested, and verified. They reflect independent execution, not theory or assumption." Our team has operated without the constraints of hierarchical decision-making, enabling rapid iteration and validated performance. The subtle implication was clear. While they had the resources and personnel, they lacked the autonomy, focus, and first-hand ownership that had fueled Neuralink's success. The room shifted. Their previous dismissals were now irrelevant. Questions came swiftly from the investors, probing potential challenges, deployment logistics, and scalability. Each question was met with clear, evidence-backed responses. Derek outlined backend optimizations. Lena explained integration and data security. Marco showcased visualization dashboards and predictive outputs. The synergy of the team underscored the depth and competency of Neuralink. As the session drew to its conclusion, the investors exchanged glances. Their interest was tangible, their commitment growing. "We are confident in moving forward with your proposal," one of them stated. "The next phase is investment and deployment planning. Your system has demonstrated clear superiority and readiness." The former company representatives shifted uncomfortably. Carter's composed facade faltered slightly, and the whispers among his team betrayed a dawning realization. The employee they had dismissed, the project they had rejected, had now surpassed them decisively. I allowed myself a controlled smile. "Thank you. The opportunity is validated by performance, not precedent." The results are indisputable and the pathway forward is clear. The room settled into a charged silence. Our success was evident. Neuralink had proven itself capable, autonomous, and superior. The investors affirmed next steps. Contracts would be drafted. Funding would be released. Deployment schedules would commence. I glanced at Derek, Lena, and Marco. Their expressions were a mixture of relief, pride, and exhilaration. 12 years of doubt, subtle exclusion, and humiliation had culminated in this tangible, undeniable success. The project had moved from dismissed concept to recognized, valuable, and profitable initiative. As the meeting concluded, the former company representatives gathered their notes. Their departure was quiet, no confrontation, only acknowledgement of the outcome. Their silence spoke volumes. The dismissive power they had wielded no longer held sway. The plot twist was complete. After the investors departed, my team lingered briefly. I addressed them. "This is only the beginning. Today we proved our capability, but the next steps will define the trajectory. Execution, discipline, and focus will carry us forward." We returned to the workspace late afternoon, a quiet celebration of validation taking shape. Emails confirmed investor commitments. Legal documents were prepared for signing. Operational plans for expansion were finalized. The algorithm, now recognized and valued, was poised for scaling. I took a moment alone, reviewing the final slides and datasets. The journey from dismissal to dominance had not been linear. Each obstacle, exclusion, and dismissal had been transformed into steps leading to this moment. The $2,000 once laughed at had been the seed. The algorithm once scorned was now the foundation of an enterprise recognized by external investors and validated against the very team that had underestimated it. The evening light filtered through the office windows, painting the room in soft gold. I reflected on the irony. The corporate hierarchy that had attempted to erase my work had inadvertently preserved it, leaving it intact and verifiable. My ownership was unassailable. The power dynamic had shifted completely. I allowed myself a rare moment of satisfaction, not triumph in the sense of vengeance, but fulfillment in recognition, justice through merit. 12 years of exclusion had culminated in decisive success. The company that had sought to undermine me had unwittingly demonstrated the necessity of independent creation, focus, and resilience. The contracts would be signed. Funding would be allocated. Neuralink would move forward, validated, recognized, and unstoppable. The plot twist was not just personal, it was operational, strategic, and visible. And in this, the work, the team, and the vision had prevailed. The morning light fell soft through the windows of our small headquarters. Neuralink was no longer just an idea, it was a living, breathing operation. The algorithm had proven itself. Investors were committed. The pilot had shown measurable results. And yet, I knew the real work was only beginning. I walked through the office, noting the hum of monitors, the quiet focus of Derek adjusting code modules, Lena analyzing data flows, and Marco refining dashboards for clarity. Each member of the team moved with confidence. Their trust in the process, in each other, and in me was tangible. I paused at my desk and reviewed the updated schedules. Expansion plans, client onboarding, and refinement timelines filled the calendar. Each task was meticulously detailed, accounting for every resource, every milestone, and every risk. The foundation for sustainable growth was in place. The first client meeting of the day arrived promptly. I presented the expanded capabilities of the algorithm, demonstrating its predictive accuracy and reliability across a larger dataset. The client representatives leaned forward, eyes widening as the insights unfolded. Each prediction was actionable. Each trend revealed opportunities they had not realized existed. After the meeting, I turned to my team. "This is the moment where we shift from proof to performance," I said. "The results are recognized, but now we must demonstrate consistency and scalability. Every interaction counts, every output matters." Derek adjusted the backend systems. Lena prepared reports for upcoming reviews. Marco refined visualizations, ensuring clarity and ease of interpretation. I oversaw the integration, providing guidance and ensuring cohesion. Each member operated autonomously yet in perfect alignment with the vision. By midday, we had logged every client interaction, every result, and every anomaly. The team moved quickly, efficiently, and with purpose. There was a rhythm to our work, a cadence born of shared understanding and mutual respect. This was not just a project, it was a culture we were creating. That afternoon, I drafted a brief for industry publications. The pilot results, the initial success, and the vision for expansion were highlighted in a concise, professional format. I emphasized clarity and impact, ensuring the message communicated both innovation and responsibility. The press release would be a subtle announcement, attracting attention without oversharing proprietary details. Lena reviewed the draft. "It is clear, precise, and credible," she said. "It communicates the achievement without exaggeration." I nodded. "Exactly. Credibility builds long-term trust. We want recognition, not hype. Our performance will speak louder than any press release." By late afternoon, I received confirmation from the first external client to move forward with a broader integration. The email was concise but unambiguous. They were committed, impressed by the accuracy, and ready to implement Neuralink's system in a live environment. The first tangible expansion milestone had been reached. The team gathered around the monitors, reviewing implementation plans, discussing client requirements, and ensuring all technical considerations were addressed. Each contribution was recognized, each insight valued. For the first time, the work we had built was operating independently of external approval. That evening, after the office cleared, I walked along the city streets alone. The skyline reflected in puddles from a brief rain. I reflected on the journey, the dismissal, the exclusion, the subtle erasure, and the laughter at $2,000. Each obstacle had been a catalyst, each slight an unintended gift, each dismissal a step toward autonomy. I thought about the old company. Carter's smirk, the whispers, the attempts to marginalize me, they had all contributed to the clarity I now possessed. Their failures had illuminated the path forward. The algorithm, the team, and the vision had proven resilient, effective, and superior. Back at the office, I reviewed the contracts for ongoing client engagements. Everything was in order: timelines, deliverables, reporting requirements, and compliance measures. I wanted every aspect documented, precise, and verifiable. Neuralink's reputation depended not just on results, but on reliability and professionalism. I closed my laptop and allowed myself a brief moment of reflection. 12 years of suppression had been transformed into tangible autonomy and recognition. The first external validation, the successful investor engagement, and the pilot expansion were only the beginning. The future was not just possible, it was inevitable. I spent the next morning in strategic planning. Expansion schedules, hiring considerations, and system upgrades filled the agenda. Each decision was informed by prior experience, evidence, and careful forecasting. I allocated responsibilities, ensuring that autonomy and accountability were balanced. The team responded positively, confident in their roles and in the vision guiding them. During a brief break, I considered the old company again. They were now spectators rather than participants. Their dismissal had fueled the precision, discipline, and focus required to achieve this level of success. The irony was not lost on me. What they had tried to suppress had grown beyond their reach. I returned to my desk and updated internal tracking systems. Each KPI, each project milestone, and each client interaction was logged. This was not micromanagement, but a foundation of transparency and accuracy. Neuralink's operations would be measured, accountable, and credible at every level. By late afternoon, I reviewed correspondence from potential partners, scheduling discussions to explore collaborations and pilot integrations. The interest was tangible, curiosity and recognition blending in equal measure. The network was expanding, and each interaction reinforced Neuralink's legitimacy and reach. The evening concluded with a quiet check-in with the team. "Today we consolidated success," I said. "Tomorrow we build on it. Recognition is not an endpoint. It is a platform. Our responsibility is to operate with excellence, continuously demonstrating capability and reliability." We shared a brief discussion of priorities, ensuring that immediate technical tasks, client engagements, and internal processes were aligned. Each team member left with clarity of purpose, confidence in their contributions, and awareness of the trajectory we had established. I stayed behind for a few moments, gazing out the window. The city lights reflected in the glass, each flicker a reminder of opportunity, potential, and the results of persistent focus. Neuralink was no longer just a project. It was a validated operation, a team of capable individuals, and a vision that was now recognized externally. The foundation was strong. The path forward was clear. The work we had dismissed, the ideas laughed at, and the individual underestimated had now become undeniable. The following weeks moved with deliberate intensity. Neuralink was expanding steadily, each client engagement reinforcing the credibility of the algorithm. Every interaction, every implementation, and every adjustment was carefully documented, ensuring transparency and consistency. The team operated like a well-oiled machine, each member confident in their roles and aware of the collective vision. I spent mornings reviewing data, adjusting projections, and preparing reports for investors. Afternoons were devoted to strategic planning, anticipating challenges, and refining the system. Evenings were quiet moments of reflection, considering how far we had come and where we were headed. Recognition grew externally. Industry newsletters highlighted Neuralink's predictive capabilities. Small interviews and panel discussions invited me to speak on innovation, autonomy, and the importance of independent thinking. I approached each opportunity carefully, presenting the vision clearly while maintaining discretion over proprietary details. Each mention, each acknowledgement, strengthened our position and validated our methods. The old company remained a distant echo. Occasionally, I received inquiries or subtle remarks through mutual contacts, hints of curiosity or disbelief. Carter's presence, once dominant in my professional life, had diminished in relevance. The dismissal, the laughter, the marginalization, they had been eclipsed by undeniable results. One afternoon, I received an invitation to a regional technology conference. The organizers requested that I speak about the practical applications of predictive analytics and user behavior modeling. I accepted, seeing it as a platform to establish both credibility and authority for Neuralink. The presentation at the conference was precise and engaging. I showcased the pilot, the expanded implementation, and the algorithm's demonstrated value. The audience, a mix of potential partners, investors, and peers, responded with curiosity, questions, and genuine interest. Each question allowed me to reinforce the validity of the system, its scalability, and its ethical application. After the session, attendees approached with inquiries, congratulations, and proposals for collaboration. The engagement was tangible, a direct contrast to the indifference and dismissal I had experienced years ago. I reflected on the journey, the struggle for recognition, the careful accumulation of proof, and the eventual validation of merit. Back at the office, the team reviewed conference feedback. Adjustments to presentations, client outreach strategies, and technical refinements were planned. Each step was deliberate, ensuring sustainable growth and reinforcing the credibility of the system. I guided the process, balancing oversight with autonomy, trusting the team to execute effectively. Weeks turned into months. Neuralink's reputation solidified. Clients reported measurable improvements in retention and behavior prediction. Investor confidence increased, resulting in additional funding and expansion opportunities. The algorithm evolved, incorporating new datasets, refining predictive models, and achieving even greater accuracy. I reflected on the personal journey that had brought us here. 12 years of marginalization, subtle exclusion, and dismissal had forged resilience, precision, and determination. The moments of doubt, the small humiliations, and the overt dismissals had been catalysts, shaping the strategy, rigor, and focus that now drove success. Occasionally, I revisited the contract clause that had been pivotal. Rejected proposals with no material company investment are not considered company property if independent creation is provable. I had documented, verified, and leveraged it meticulously. What had once seemed a small legal detail had become a foundation for autonomy and growth. The team had grown, but the culture remained intact: merit, focus, transparency, and collaboration. Each new member understood the standards, the ethos, and the mission. The work environment reflected the values that had guided us from the outset, ensuring both effectiveness and integrity. On a quiet evening, I walked through the city streets, reflecting on the journey from dismissal to recognition, from marginalization to authority. The skyline shimmered with possibilities, each light a reminder of effort, perseverance, and vision. The laughter, the smirks, the exclusion, they were all past. What remained was validation, accomplishment, and a future built on clear evidence of merit. I returned to the office and sat at my desk. The algorithm ran silently in the background, data streaming in, predictions forming. Investors were updated, clients engaged, and the team focused. Everything aligned with the vision we had established. I allowed myself a rare moment of satisfaction. The journey had been arduous, the obstacles formidable, but the outcome was undeniable. The project once dismissed, the individual once marginalized, had now achieved recognition, autonomy, and credibility. Looking forward, the path was clear. Expansion, refinement, and innovation would continue. Neuralink would grow, adapt, and sustain success. The foundation had been laid, the vision validated, and the future secure. As I closed the laptop for the night, I felt a sense of completion. Not of ending, but of realization. The journey from dismissal to recognition, from exclusion to authority, had culminated in a tangible, enduring outcome. The work, the proof, and the vision were undeniable. I looked out the window, the city lights reflecting possibilities, each a reminder that perseverance, precision, and integrity can transform dismissal into opportunity, skepticism into acknowledgement, and rejection into the foundation for lasting achievement. The story had reached its resolution. The triumph was not born of confrontation, but of preparation, merit, and unwavering dedication. The future awaited, and this time it was mine to define.